When I walked past the bathroom and saw my stepson kneeling by the sink, shirtless, trying to fix the broken faucet, something inside me shifted, not from guilt, and not from fear. From something else entirely. I told myself it was harmless. A passing thought. Just admiration. But the way the steam clung to his skin, the way the water trickled down his forearm and the quiet concentration in his eyes, it made me linger. I stood there too long. Long enough for him to notice me. He turned, surprised, and smiled that half-smile he always had as a boy, only now it belonged to a man. I should have walked away. I should have said something casual, something maternal. But I didn't. I stood frozen, my hand still on the doorframe, heart beating like a warning drum. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between us, like static in the air before a storm. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head. That I was projecting emotions I didn't understand onto someone who had simply come home. But later, that same evening, I caught my husband watching me through the kitchen window. Not watching me cook. Watching me look. Watching where my gaze lingered. He didn't say a word. Just observed. As if he already knew. Or maybe was waiting to see how far it would go. And I need to tell you how it began, not the act itself, but everything before it. Because the moment you cross a line, the moment your heart moves even a little towards someone it shouldn't, that's where the real story begins. So let me take you back to the first time I realized I wasn't just a wife anymore. I was something else entirely. But before I share the truth I've buried so long, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And, have you ever crossed a line you swore you never would? There's something haunting about a perfectly tidy house. When every pillow is fluffed, every dish in place, every light timed just right, it stops feeling like a home and starts feeling like a stage. That was the kind of house I lived in. Immaculate. Polished. Silent. And for a while, I told myself it was enough. My husband and I had our routines. Mornings with separate newspapers. Evenings with different shows. Dinner together, but always with the news on. We never fought, not really. We didn't need to. Silence covered everything we didn't say, like snow over a dying garden. And maybe, in some strange way, I was proud of that. We weren't one of those loud couples. We were respectable. Steady. Still, sometimes I would catch myself standing in front of the mirror longer than I needed to. Adjusting a sweater. Adding perfume even though I wasn't going anywhere. There was no one to notice but me. And noticing was starting to feel lonely. Then, one Thursday afternoon, he called. I hadn't heard his voice in months. It was deeper now, more grounded. He told me he'd broken up with his girlfriend and was between apartments. Said he needed a place to stay. Just for a little while. I hesitated. Not because I didn't want him here, but because something tightened in my chest the moment I heard his name. I pushed that thought away, told myself it was just the motherly instinct. The familiar urge to take care of someone. When he arrived, the house changed. He brought life with him, clutter, laughter, noise. His duffel bag dumped by the door, shoes kicked off anywhere, music playing from his phone. It annoyed my husband, I could tell. But I found it comforting. Like the house exhaled after years of holding its breath. He greeted me with a warm hug. Nothing inappropriate. Just genuine. But when he pulled back, he looked at me, really looked at me. And I felt it. That flicker. That blink of something I wasn't ready to name. He had grown into himself. Confident without arrogance. Easy with his body. And unlike my husband, who rarely looked up from his paper, my stepson actually saw people. He noticed when I changed my hair. He complimented the food. He asked questions and waited for answers. That evening, while clearing the table, he offered to fix the leaky faucet in the guest bathroom. "I've done it before," he said. "It's not a big deal." I thanked him. My husband barely glanced up. Later, as I folded laundry in the hallway, I heard the metallic clink of tools. Water hissing. A muttered curse. The door was slightly ajar, steam seeping out into the hall. I walked over to close it, that's all I meant to do. But then I saw him. Kneeling shirtless beside the sink, sleeves rolled up, focused. Water beaded on his back. Muscles shifting under skin. And I froze. It was seconds. Maybe less. But it felt like minutes. He turned suddenly and caught me there. I expected him to cover up, to laugh, to joke. But he didn't. He just smiled. "Almost done," he said. "This thing's a mess." I nodded too quickly. "Thanks for doing that," I managed. My voice cracked. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the moment. Wondering what it meant. If it meant anything. And if it did, what kind of woman did that make me? The next morning, my husband left early for golf. I was alone in the kitchen, sipping tea, when my stepson walked in. Hair still wet, wearing an old t-shirt and sweatpants. He smiled, poured himself a cup of coffee, and sat across from me. "How'd you sleep?" he asked. I lied. "Fine." We talked about nothing, weather, breakfast, a podcast he liked. But something in the air had shifted. Words floated heavy between us. Every silence felt louder. Every glance, longer. At one point, I asked about his plans. Whether he'd found a new apartment yet. He shrugged. "Not really in a rush." I should have felt annoyed. This wasn't a hotel. But instead, something in me tightened. A pull I didn't understand. The doorbell rang. My husband returned earlier than expected. When he stepped into the kitchen, he paused. Just slightly. His eyes flicked between us. Then he smiled. "You two look cozy," he said. It was a harmless comment. But it burned. After lunch, I retreated to the bedroom. Closed the door. Sat on the edge of the bed, breathing shallow. I told myself I was imagining things. That nothing had happened. That nothing would happen. But deep down, I already knew I'd crossed something invisible. Not a line, a threshold. And there was no going back. The next morning began like any other, but I carried something with me, a tension under the skin, a flicker that wouldn't go out. I moved through the kitchen mechanically, slicing fruit, boiling water for tea, laying out plates as if that routine could silence what had happened in my mind the day before. But it clung to me. I could still feel the air of that bathroom. The damp tile. The moment. The look in his eyes. And mine. My husband had already left for work. He hadn't said much over breakfast. Then again, he rarely did. A few words about traffic, a comment about the thermostat, and that was it. Sometimes, silence is comfortable. Other times, it feels like a locked door you've forgotten how to open. Lately, ours had been the second kind. By the time my stepson came downstairs, I had convinced myself I was fine. That nothing had happened. That I had overread everything, overreacted to nothing. I smiled too brightly when he entered the room. He said good morning in a low, easy voice and reached for the coffee pot. We barely spoke, but everything felt louder. The clink of his spoon in the mug, the soft shuffle of his socks on the tile, the creak of the chair when he sat down, all of it pressed into my nerves. I focused on cleaning the counter, unnecessarily wiping it again and again, like scrubbing away thoughts. Then the faucet sputtered again. It had started leaking more heavily overnight, a fast drip that echoed in the silence. He stood and moved toward it without a word, crouching down just as he had the day before. That familiar motion, that same focus. But today, I didn't stay across the room. I stepped closer. I really should call a plumber, I said, more to fill the space than anything. He didn't look up. I'm already in too deep. Might as well finish. The sound of his voice so close to the floor made something tighten in me. I shouldn't have lingered. But I did. I leaned slightly on the counter, watching the slope of his back, the curve of his neck, the way the steam from the kettle curled around him like breath. When he finally stood up, wiping his hands with the towel, I hadn't realized how close I'd moved. We were only a step apart. He looked at me, not with surprise or discomfort, but something steadier. I should have stepped back. I didn't. Sorry, I said awkwardly, realizing I was in his space. I was just. And then we kissed. It happened without warning, without permission, without plan. His mouth on mine, soft but certain. My body didn't flinch. It leaned. For one suspended moment, I let it happen. Then I stepped away. The room rushed back into focus, the ticking of the clock, the sound of a bird outside the window, the kettle beginning to whistle. I looked at him, my breath short, my heart hammering like it wanted out. He didn't say a word. And neither did I. I turned, quickly, and walked out of the kitchen. My hands trembled as I reached the stairs, and I gripped the banister like I needed anchoring. Upstairs, behind the safety of the closed bedroom door, I pressed my fingers to my lips as if trying to erase the sensation. I told myself it had been a mistake. That the moment had gotten away from me. That I was still in control. But when I came back downstairs 15 minutes later, my husband was standing in the doorway. Jacket on, shoes still wet from the rain, holding a bag of groceries. He must have arrived just after I fled. His face was neutral. Too neutral. There was traffic, he said simply, setting the bag down on the table. I forced a smile. Glad you're back. He nodded and began unpacking the bag, listing off what he'd bought. Bread, olive oil, milk. I answered in short phrases. Thank you. That's perfect. We needed that. But something in his movements felt precise, careful, deliberate. As though he were acting, too. I noticed his gaze linger slightly on the coffee cup still out. On the towel draped over the sink. On the way the chairs were positioned. Subtle details. Nothing he mentioned. Later that day, I found myself reorganizing the linen closet, a chore I'd been avoiding for years. I needed something mindless, something to drown the thudding rhythm in my chest. The scent of folded towels, the textures beneath my fingers, all became a distraction. When my husband came upstairs to change, I held my breath. I waited for a question, a look, anything. But he just walked past the closet, murmured something about dinner, and disappeared into the bathroom. I followed the sound of water running. I stood outside the closed door and wondered, had he seen us? Heard us? Did he know? The possibility hung in the air like smoke. At dinner, we sat like actors reading old lines. My husband chewed methodically, asked about the garden, mentioned an email from his sister. My stepson answered politely, eyes low, voice steady. I responded where necessary, smiling at the appropriate moments, feeling each one like a paper cut. No one brought up the faucet. Or the kiss. Or the long silence that came after. When I cleared the dishes, I moved mechanically, rinsing plates I'd barely touched. My mind was a jumble of ifs and maybes and consequences I couldn't name yet. I heard the faint sound of laughter from the living room, his and my husband's. They were watching something together. Laughing. That laughter struck me harder than anything else had that day. Because it was normal. Because it was wrong. I went upstairs early and sat in the dark. I didn't turn on the light. I just stared at the window, at the reflection of myself sitting still, trying to understand who I was in that moment. I wasn't innocent. That much I knew. But I wasn't entirely sure what I had become. And somehow, that uncertainty was the most terrifying thing of all. I woke up before the sun. The bedroom was still cloaked in soft shadows, but my mind was already sharp, restless. I lay still, eyes open, listening to the slow breath of my husband beside me, his familiar shape a silhouette against the fading darkness. I could tell he was asleep by the way his chest rose and fell in quiet rhythm. Or perhaps he was only pretending. I couldn't be sure anymore. That was the thing, after a boundary is crossed, certainty dissolves in the most ordinary moments. I slipped out of bed gently, careful not to disturb him, and padded across the floor to the window. The glass was cool under my fingertips. Outside, the street was empty. Still. The kind of quiet that feels heavy instead of peaceful. It matched the silence inside me. My reflection in the glass was pale and blurred. I barely recognized it. My face looked older somehow. Not in years, but in weight. In decisions. In consequences. I needed to get out of the house. By the time I came downstairs, both men were already awake. My husband was dressed in his usual crisp shirt, drinking coffee and scrolling through the news on his tablet. My stepson leaned against the counter, barefoot, wearing a hoodie. Their postures couldn't have been more different, one precise and orderly, the other loose and relaxed. And yet, they mirrored each other in some strange, silent way. Both not speaking more than needed. Both aware. I poured myself a cup of tea, my hands trembling just enough that I had to steady the mug with both palms. The silence stretched. My husband broke it first. "Need anything from the store?" he asked without looking up. I shook my head. No. I was actually thinking of going out for a bit. Into the city. He raised his eyes briefly. "Anything particular?" "Just errands," I lied. He nodded once, expression unreadable. Then he returned to his screen. I could feel my stepson's eyes on me, though he didn't speak. The tension in the room was unbearable, not loud, not overt, but threaded through every breath. I left an hour later, telling myself I needed distance, fresh air, noise, something to dilute the ache that had taken root in me. The drive was long and quiet, the road winding out of the suburb and into the more chaotic rhythm of the city. I didn't have a destination, just the need to move. I parked near the river and walked aimlessly. Past cafes with people laughing, past shops full of things I didn't need, past young couples holding hands. I used to do that once, hold hands. Not as a gesture, but as a habit. That intimacy had vanished so gradually, I hadn't noticed until it was gone. The river shimmered in the morning light. I sat on a bench and watched it move. Constant. Steady. I envied its direction. Eventually, I found myself outside a bookstore and walked in without thinking. I ran my fingers along the spines of novels, biographies, memoirs. I picked up a few at random, flipped through pages I couldn't focus on, and left without buying anything. I didn't want fiction. I didn't want anyone else's story. I needed to understand mine. Back home, the house felt colder. I stepped inside and was greeted by silence. Not the comforting kind. The kind that made you pause and listen harder. Something was different. I found them both in the living room. My husband was on the couch, reading. My stepson sat across from him, headphones around his neck, holding a cup of coffee. For a moment, it looked like any normal afternoon. But their silence felt rehearsed. I wondered what they'd spoken about while I was gone. If they'd spoken at all. Later that evening, I made dinner. My hands moved automatically, chop, stir, taste, plate, but my thoughts were somewhere else. They sat at the table like they always did, in their usual places. No one brought up the faucet. No one brought up the morning. During the meal, my husband asked about my errands. I gave vague answers. He didn't press. Instead, he told a story about someone from work. My stepson added a comment. They both laughed. And just like that, the moment passed. As if we were just a normal family having a normal dinner on a normal evening. But I couldn't play the part today. After dinner, I went to the bedroom and closed the door behind me. I stood in the center of the room, suddenly unsure what to do with myself. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor. My thoughts were a swirl: regret, guilt, confusion, anger at myself for not being able to sort any of it out. I heard footsteps in the hallway. A brief pause outside the door. Then retreating again. I didn't move. That night, I dreamt of water. A leaking faucet. A flooded floor. A rising tide that covered everything. In the dream, I stood in the middle of it all, watching as it crept higher. I didn't run. I didn't fight it. I just stood there, letting it rise. I woke up before dawn, heart pounding, the image still fresh behind my eyelids. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, wondering what part of me had let it all begin. And why another part, even now, didn't want it to end. The morning air carried the first signs of summer, soft warmth rising through the windows, the smell of cut grass from somewhere down the street. I stood in the kitchen, watching the sunlight fall across the floor, and felt like I was witnessing something too beautiful for the weight I carried inside. I hadn't spoken much since the previous day. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't trust myself to speak without unraveling. There was a tightness in my chest that no deep breath could ease, a knot that had formed between who I was and who I was becoming, or maybe had already become. I noticed the silence more when the house was full. It's strange how three people can occupy the same space and yet move like ghosts around each other. My husband had returned to his usual schedule: coffee, newspaper, mild comments about the day. He seemed unchanged on the surface, but I could feel something quiet simmering beneath his routine. A shift. Not in how he spoke to me, but in how he watched me. My stepson had become more reserved too. Not cold, but cautious. He avoided being alone in the same room with me for too long, like proximity had grown dangerous. Our conversations had shrunk to practicalities: did you want the car, or do we have eggs? And each time our eyes met, I felt a tremor pass through my spine. That afternoon, my husband suggested we have dinner out. Somewhere in the city. He said it lightly, as if it were a sudden idea, but I knew better. He wasn't the type to plan spontaneously. And yet, I agreed. I didn't even ask why. Maybe I was hoping for normalcy. Maybe I was afraid of the alternative. We dressed quietly. I wore a black blouse I hadn't put on in years. It still fit, but now hugged differently. I caught myself adding lipstick, then immediately wiping it off. It felt like too much. My stepson didn't come with us. He said he had plans with a friend, and the relief I felt was immediate, shameful. I couldn't bear the idea of sitting between them, two men whose worlds I now tilted. The restaurant was quiet, tucked between two old bookstores. We sat near a window, with candles on the table that flickered even without a breeze. My husband ordered wine for us both, and when the waiter left, we sat in silence. For the first time in what felt like months, he looked at me, truly looked, not with suspicion, but with a kind of careful attention. I didn't know whether to be grateful or terrified. He asked about my week. I gave him summaries, edited versions of my days. He nodded thoughtfully. He spoke about work, about a colleague's retirement, about an article he read. I nodded too, sipped my wine, played the role. But I could feel the subtext pressing underneath every sentence. I kept waiting for it to surface. But it never did. We returned home just after dark. The porch light was on. The house felt oddly still, as if it were holding its breath. When I stepped inside, I paused. Something was off, not missing, just rearranged in a way I couldn't place. I found my stepson in the kitchen, pouring tea. He turned, startled for a moment, then relaxed. "Hey," he said, voice low. I nodded. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," he replied. Quiet night. Our eyes met briefly. Just long enough. I moved past him toward the stairs, and for a moment, I felt the warmth of his presence too close behind me. But he didn't follow. I didn't look back. In the bedroom, I undressed slowly. Every motion deliberate, like peeling away something heavier than fabric. My husband walked in as I stood at the mirror, brushing my hair. He paused for a second, then set his watch on the dresser and began to undress. I watched him through the mirror. Noticed the slump in his shoulders, the way he moved a little slower these days. Age had crept in quietly, same as it had with me. And yet, he still looked like the man I married. Only now, the gap between us felt wider than the years allowed. He climbed into bed without a word. I joined him moments later. We lay side by side, eyes to the ceiling, saying nothing. The hum of the ceiling fan filled the space between us. Eventually, I whispered something, I don't even remember what, just to hear my voice. He murmured a reply. Nothing significant. And yet, I caught a glance from him that lingered a second too long. Not suspicion. Not affection. Just study. As if he were waiting to decide something. The next morning came too quickly. My stepson was gone before breakfast. I didn't ask where. My husband was in the backyard trimming hedges, headphones in. The house belonged to me again, quiet, predictable, under control. So I cleaned. I moved from room to room, scrubbing floors that didn't need scrubbing, reorganizing cabinets that hadn't been touched in months. I needed order. I needed surfaces I could wipe clean. I needed something to show for the hours. In the hallway, I found a photograph tucked behind a loose book on the shelf. It was an old one, the three of us on the beach, years ago. Before the lines blurred. Before time etched its distance into our faces. I held it for a long moment, tracing the edges of it with my thumb. The smiles in the picture felt too big, too bright. Or maybe they just felt honest, which made them hard to look at. I put it back where I found it. Later, as the sun began to set, I took a walk. Just around the block. I needed air, distance, perspective, anything but walls. I passed the houses I'd seen for years, the mailboxes I could name, the trees I had watched change with every season. Nothing looked different. Everything looked different. When I returned, the lights were on. My husband sat in the den, reading. My stepson sat in the armchair by the fireplace, scrolling through something on his phone. Neither looked up when I entered. But I felt it, that awareness. That stillness. That moment when everyone knows something but no one dares to say it. I walked past them with a quiet nod, climbed the stairs, and sat alone in the bedroom for what felt like hours. It wasn't fear that filled me anymore. It was anticipation. Of what, I wasn't sure. But I knew something was coming. Something I could no longer avoid. I didn't mean for us to be alone. That wasn't the plan. If anything, I had done everything possible to avoid it. I filled my days with errands, with chores that didn't need doing, with visits to stores where I didn't buy anything. I even offered to drive my husband to work that morning, pretending it was to save him the hassle of parking, when in reality I just needed him out of the house. And yet, as I pulled into the driveway later and stepped inside, I realized he hadn't taken the car. He'd called a rideshare. Which meant one thing: my stepson was still home. I found him in the backyard, sitting on the old wooden swing that hung from the oak tree. It had been there for years, a relic from when neighborhood kids used to visit and spend summer evenings running barefoot through the grass. The ropes were weathered now, but strong. He rocked slowly, his phone in one hand, a coffee mug in the other. I should have turned around. I should have walked straight into the kitchen, put on music, started cleaning something. Anything. But I didn't. Instead, I stepped outside and let the door close quietly behind me. He looked up when he heard the click of the latch. His face didn't change much, no surprise, no smile. Just a kind of alert stillness. I joined him near the tree, standing rather than sitting. The sun was soft behind the clouds, the air thick with the scent of blooming things. For a long time, we didn't speak. I asked if he had plans for the day. He said no. He asked if I wanted coffee. I said I'd already had too much. Everything we said sounded wrong, as if spoken from behind glass. He gestured toward the swing next to him, the second seat that rarely held any weight these days. I hesitated. Then I sat. We rocked in silence for a while, the creaking of the ropes the only sound between us. It wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't unbearable either. It was suspended, like the moment itself. He finally spoke. He said he'd been thinking about leaving. Not in anger, not even in regret. Just that it might be better. For everyone. His voice was calm, measured. But his eyes stayed fixed on a spot far ahead, where the trees thickened and the sky disappeared behind them. I nodded slowly, unsure whether I agreed or hoped he wouldn't follow through. He turned toward me then, really looking at me. I could feel the weight of it, not lust, not accusation. Something more difficult to name. It sat between us like a question neither of us knew how to ask. I said something vague, something about things being complicated. He said they didn't have to be. That life is mostly about choices, not complications. That was when I looked away. Because I didn't want to admit he was right. We sat there for several more minutes before I stood up, brushing off my jeans as if I could shake the moment loose. I said I should check the laundry. He didn't try to stop me. But later, in the kitchen, he appeared again. I was rinsing fruit, the cold water numbing my fingertips, and I felt him behind me before I heard his footsteps. He didn't speak. He didn't move closer. Just stood there, letting the silence drape itself over the tiled floor and the humming refrigerator. When I finally turned around, we were too close. The distance we'd kept, all those polite evasions and detours, dissolved without ceremony. There was no wind-up, no long stare, no dramatic pause. We kissed. And the world went quiet. It was brief. But it happened. When I pulled away, I didn't say anything. I couldn't. My heart was loud in my chest, pounding like it wanted to protest, or escape. I backed away, turned, and walked out of the room. My hands were shaking again, the way they had after the first time. I made it halfway up the stairs before I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. My husband. He was standing at the top of the landing, still in his work clothes, holding a folder and his glasses in the other hand. I don't know how long he'd been there. I don't know what he had seen, if anything at all. But he wasn't moving. He wasn't blinking. And then he did something that froze my blood more than anything else ever could. He smiled. A small, polite smile. The kind you offer a stranger at the store when your carts bump. No malice. No warmth. Just recognition. He stepped aside so I could pass. I walked the rest of the way up as if nothing had happened. But everything had. Later that night, we had dinner. The three of us. I cooked. My husband poured the wine. My stepson set the table. We sat and ate and talked about the forecast, about some new building going up across town, about the neighbor's dog who had finally stopped barking at night. If someone had filmed it and played it back without sound, it would have looked like a portrait of normalcy. But I knew the truth was slipping underneath every word. After the dishes were done, my husband went to his office. My stepson said he was going for a walk. I climbed into bed fully clothed, too tired to undress, too awake to sleep. The ceiling above me was blank and unblinking. I stared at it like it might provide answers. But all it gave me was time. And time, I was beginning to realize, wasn't something I had much of anymore. At least not in the way I wanted. Not without choices. Not without fallout. The lines I thought I could control were now gone. And I wasn't sure which version of myself had crossed them first. There was a moment the next morning, brief, almost forgettable, where I thought I could rewind everything. I stood in the kitchen, holding a warm mug of tea between both hands, watching the sun stretch across the floor. It looked like any other morning. The kind where you still have time to decide the course of your day. The kind where things haven't broken yet. But that illusion shattered the moment I turned and caught sight of my husband standing in the doorway. He said nothing, only walked past me and reached for the newspaper. But the way he moved, slow, deliberate, distant, told me more than words could. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even confusion. It was awareness. Heavy, settled, and completely unreadable. We went about our routines as if nothing had changed. The clinking of cutlery. The rustle of paper. The quiet hum of the refrigerator. But every moment was sharper now. Every silence more pronounced. I felt like a guest in my own life, one step removed from everything I had helped build. I spent the morning cleaning the upstairs bathroom, scrubbing already clean surfaces just to feel like I was doing something useful. Something productive. My mind replayed every movement from the day before in painful detail. The kiss. The smile. The silence. I kept asking myself the same question over and over again, what does he know? But I already knew the answer. Everything. Around midday, my husband left the house. He didn't say where he was going. He only grabbed his keys and coat and said he wouldn't be late. His voice was even. Flat. The way you speak to someone you no longer trust, but still live with. Once the door closed behind him, the house felt different. Bigger. Quieter. Exposed. I walked through each room as if seeing it for the first time, the familiar couch cushions, the framed photos that hadn't been updated in years, the faded rug in the hallway. This house had once been a life. Now it felt like a museum. Everything in its place, untouched. I found my stepson in the backyard again, barefoot in the grass, reading something on his phone. When he looked up and saw me through the window, he didn't wave. He only watched. His posture was relaxed, but I could tell from the way his jaw tensed that he, too, was carrying the weight of the silence between us. I considered not going outside. I considered retreating to the safety of a locked door, letting the hours pass unnoticed. But something in me resisted that. Something in me needed to face the thing I had been avoiding. So I stepped out. The grass was cool beneath my feet, damp from the morning dew. The breeze smelled like soil and cut with a familiar, grounding. He didn't speak when I reached him, but he set his phone down and shifted slightly on the bench. An invitation. I sat beside him, my hands folded tightly in my lap. For a while, we just listened to the wind. Birds chattered in the distance. A neighbor's lawnmower started up a few houses away. Life was continuing, unbothered, unaware. He finally broke the silence. He said he'd been thinking of leaving for real this time. Not just the house, but the city. He had a job offer. Nothing exciting, but far enough. New enough. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to tell him to go, to remove the temptation, to untangle the knot that was quickly tightening around all of us. But the other part, the louder part, the one I had tried to bury, didn't want that at all. He looked at me and asked if I was okay. The simplicity of the question almost broke me. I lied. I told him I was fine. He nodded, as if he knew I would say that, and didn't expect anything else. That afternoon, my husband returned earlier than expected. I heard the front door, the distinct click of his shoes on the tile. I met him in the hallway. He looked at me briefly, then turned and walked into his office. He left the door open. Later, during dinner, he spoke more than usual. He asked my stepson about his job applications, about plans for the weekend, about whether he needed help with anything. His tone was pleasant, almost cheerful. It was unbearable. Because beneath every word was something else. Something heavy and sharp and unspoken. I could barely eat. I pushed food around my plate, nodding in all the right places, pretending not to notice how he never once asked me a question. After dinner, I stood at the sink washing dishes. I heard them both in the living room, quiet voices, the sound of a sports broadcast in the background. I tried to focus on the rhythm of the water, on the soap, on the clink of porcelain. But I couldn't ignore the ache in my chest. Not guilt. Not shame. Grief. Grief for something I hadn't even fully had. For something I had wanted, not because it was wrong, but because it had made me feel alive. That night, I sat in the dark of the guest room. Not because I was hiding, not exactly, but because the bedroom felt too big, too shared, too layered with years of silence. I stared at the walls, at the small bookshelf, at the familiar lampshade. Every object seemed to hold a memory I didn't want to revisit. My husband never came to find me. I heard him moving about upstairs, then silence. Then the soft creak of the bed. Then nothing. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually I lay down, fully clothed, the covers pulled just over my legs. I stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine what tomorrow would bring. Another breakfast. Another silence. Another moment of pretending everything was intact. But deep down, I knew that the structure we were clinging to was no longer holding. We were all standing on different sides of a fault line, waiting for it to crack. And when it did, when the moment finally came, I wasn't sure which one of us would fall first. The next day began like the last few, heavy with unsaid things, wrapped in a kind of silence that no longer felt peaceful. It had texture now, this silence. You could almost touch it, feel its weight in the air, like the thick humidity before a summer storm. And I knew, as surely as I knew my own name, that something had to give. We couldn't keep orbiting one another, pretending nothing had changed, when the air between us was so charged it felt dangerous to breathe. My husband left early. He said something about needing to meet a client before noon. He looked me in the eye as he said it, his face neutral. But the way he adjusted his cufflinks with such focus made me think the routine had become his shield. I envied that. The ability to hide so well in habit. After he drove off, the house exhaled. It always did when one of us left now. as if even the walls had grown exhausted from holding it all in. I spent the morning alone, folding laundry I didn't need to fold, organizing drawers that hadn't been opened in months. I moved like someone expecting to be interrupted, though no one came. Not at first. When I finally stepped outside to catch a breath of air, I saw him. My stepson. He was sitting in the car, in the driveway, staring ahead, engine off. He didn't move for a long time. I thought maybe he'd fallen asleep. But then he opened the door and stepped out slowly, like someone who wasn't sure where they were supposed to go. He didn't see me right away. I stood behind the curtain at the living room window and watched him. Not like a voyeur, but like someone afraid to step back into a conversation they didn't know how to start. When he finally turned toward the house, I moved. I didn't want him to see me like that, watching, unsure, caught between retreat and approach. Minutes passed. I heard his footsteps on the porch, the soft creak of the front door, and then nothing. I found him in the kitchen, pouring water into the kettle. His movements were quiet, precise, a mirror of my husband's in some ways, but more present. Less automatic. He glanced over his shoulder when he noticed me. There was no smile. Just recognition. As if we'd both finally arrived at the same place after taking different roads. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The question lingered between us, unspoken, undeniable. What now? I broke the silence first. I asked if he wanted to get out of the house. I didn't say why. He didn't ask. We ended up driving aimlessly, letting the road decide. The city disappeared behind us as we headed north, past open fields and sleepy neighborhoods, into the kind of landscape where time seemed to stretch and soften. We didn't talk much during the drive. The radio played softly, filling the silence with voices that weren't ours. Eventually, we stopped at a small roadside diner, the kind that smelled of coffee and old vinyl seats. We ordered food we didn't eat. Sat across from each other with our hands curled around warm mugs, both of us avoiding eye contact. I wanted to ask him what he was thinking. Whether he regretted anything. Whether he felt the same tension that had been keeping me up at night. But I didn't ask. I wasn't sure I could handle the answer. Instead, I said I didn't know how we got here. He said nothing. Just nodded slowly, like someone who agreed with a sentence they couldn't add to. When we left, the sky had changed. Thick clouds moved in over the horizon, and the wind carried a chill. It was the kind of day that begged for a decision, to go home or to keep driving. I kept driving. We passed signs for motels and gas stations, old barns and closed roadside shops. Each one a temptation, a possibility. I watched the rearview mirror more than the road ahead, half expecting something to catch up to us. A consequence. A voice of reason. A signal to stop. None came. Eventually, I pulled into a gravel lot beside a faded motel. I sat there, hands on the wheel, staring at the chipped paint of the building. My heart was loud again, not racing, but present. A drumbeat. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He just looked at me, waiting for me to decide. Not pushing. Not assuming. Just present. And I decided. We spent the night together. That's all I'll say. Because the truth isn't in the details. It's in the silence that followed. In the way we didn't speak as we packed our things the next morning. In the way the air had shifted between us, heavier now, more real. There was no victory in it. No triumph. Just a quiet acknowledgement of what had happened. Of what couldn't be undone. The drive home was quiet. He slept for part of it, his head resting against the window, his breath slow and even. I glanced at him once or twice, trying to memorize that version of him, the version who didn't yet carry the weight of what came next. When we reached the house, he got out first. He didn't wait. Didn't hold the door. He simply walked inside like nothing had changed. But I knew. I sat in the car for a long time after that, hands still on the wheel, engine off. I stared at the porch, the windows, the curtains I'd drawn so many times. Everything looked the same. But I wasn't. I wasn't the woman who kissed someone by mistake. I wasn't the woman who nearly crossed a line. I had crossed it. And there was no map for what came after. Coming home felt like stepping onto a stage after the curtain had already risen. The driveway looked the same. The front lawn freshly trimmed. The porch light, even though it was early afternoon, glowed faintly under the gray sky. But something inside the house had shifted. I could feel it before I even crossed the threshold, a pressure in the air, like the weight of a question left too long unanswered. I entered quietly, as if noise alone might unravel everything. The door clicked shut behind me with a softness that felt louder than it should. Shoes off. Bag down. Keys in the bowl. Every movement rehearsed, mechanical. Familiar, but wrong. The house was empty. Or at least, it felt that way. I walked through each room with slow steps, expecting some trace of what had happened to follow me in, a note, a look, a door left open in just the wrong way. But there was nothing. The kitchen was spotless. The living room untouched. The guest room door was closed. Only our bedroom held a sign of life. The closet door was ajar, one of my husband's jackets draped over the foot of the bed. It looked casual, but it felt pointed. As though it had been placed there not out of forgetfulness, but deliberation. I didn't touch it. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my hands. There was nothing remarkable about them, same shape, same rings, same soft signs of age and use. But they felt foreign to me. As if they belonged to someone else. Someone who had just made a choice they couldn't explain. The front door opened not long after. I heard it before I saw him. My husband's footsteps were unmistakable, neither hurried nor slow, but steady. A man coming home from a day that had likely been filled with meetings and emails and small talk, but now ended in a house changed by silence. He didn't call out. Just moved past the hallway and into the kitchen. I stood up, smoothed the covers on the bed with hands that still trembled faintly, and followed him. He was pouring himself a glass of water when I walked in. He glanced at me once, just long enough to acknowledge my presence, and then returned his attention to the faucet. The same faucet I had stood in front of days ago when everything started to tilt. "How was your day?" he asked. The question hung between us like a test. I opened my mouth, but no answer came. Not an honest one, anyway. So I nodded. "Fine." He took a sip. Set the glass down. Then leaned against the counter in a way that reminded me of how he used to talk to me when we were younger, casually, openly, before everything became about errands and calendars and timing. Before habit swallowed intimacy whole. "I thought you were home earlier," he said. "I was," I replied. And that was it. No accusations. No pointed looks. Just an acknowledgement. A puzzle piece set down without force. We moved through the evening like dancers in an old routine. He read the newspaper in the living room. I made dinner, a pasta dish I could make without thinking, because thinking felt dangerous right now. My stepson didn't come down until just before the food was ready. His entrance was silent, like a shadow slipping into its shape. We sat together, the three of us, eating in a calm that felt rehearsed. They talked about a news story, something mundane and local. I chimed in when necessary, smiled at the right moments. It felt like acting. Only none of us were sure who the audience was anymore. After dinner, my husband offered to wash the dishes. It surprised me, but I let him. I watched him from the table as he moved through the motions with quiet precision, like someone trying to solve a problem through repetition. My stepson left the room first. No eye contact. No words. Just a quiet retreat. I lingered in the dining room, unsure of where to go. The house no longer offered safe corners. Every room carried weight now. Eventually, I made my way back upstairs and stood in the doorway of our bedroom. The jacket was still there, untouched. I considered folding it, returning it to its place. But I couldn't bring myself to move it. Instead, I walked to the bathroom, turned on the faucet, and washed my face slowly. The water was warm, grounding. It helped me remember where I was, who I was, or who I was supposed to be. When I returned to the bedroom, my husband was already there, sitting on the edge of the bed with his back to me. He didn't turn around when I entered. He just stared at the floor, his hands resting on his knees. I stood behind him for a moment, unsure of what to say. Then he spoke. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice quiet, "about how things feel different lately." I swallowed, unsure if he was leading to a question or a confession. He continued. "I'm not angry. I keep wondering when it happened. When we stopped noticing each other." The words landed like a stone. I sat down beside him, but still didn't speak. I couldn't. Not without unraveling completely. "I don't need an explanation," he added. "Not now. I just need to know if you're still here." It wasn't a question of location. It never is in moments like these. It was a question of presence. Of loyalty. Of heart. And I didn't know how to answer. Because I wasn't sure if I was still here. Not in the way he meant. That night, we lay side by side in bed, our bodies close but untouched. The silence between us was no longer sharp. It was soft now. Muted. Like the calm after a storm you didn't see coming. I stared at the ceiling again, wondering how many nights had passed with me doing the same thing, staring, searching, hoping for clarity. But the only thing I knew for sure was this: the truth had taken root. And it would grow, no matter how much I tried to ignore it. The days that followed blurred together like watercolor left too long in the rain. Time moved, certainly, but with a rhythm I could no longer track. Each morning I awoke in the same bed, next to the same man, surrounded by the same walls, and yet, something fundamental had shifted. It wasn't just guilt anymore. It wasn't even fear. It was something quieter, heavier, like grief without a name. I went through the motions. I cooked. I cleaned. I answered questions. I replied to emails. I sat on the couch and listened to the ticking of the clock, wondering if the sound had always been that loud. My husband didn't press me. He didn't confront, accuse, or retreat. Instead, he became steady. Kind, even. He brought me tea in the mornings, asked if I needed anything when he returned from errands. But his eyes, those betrayed him. They lingered on me like they were waiting for someone to return. I didn't know how to be that person anymore. My stepson stayed mostly out of sight. His presence became something I felt more than saw. Footsteps down the hall. The sound of the front door opening and closing at odd hours. The occasional clang of a mug in the sink. We didn't speak. Not out of coldness, but out of necessity. Words had become too dangerous. One afternoon, I found myself standing by the laundry room window, watching the wind push through the trees. Leaves skittered across the driveway. The sky was overcast, thick with the kind of gray that swallows sound. I stood there for a long time, arms folded, thoughts circling like birds with nowhere to land. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was the stillness. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the quiet voice inside me that had grown louder each day, the one that whispered, "You need to end this." I walked down the hallway and stopped outside the guest room door. My hand hovered above the doorknob, fingers trembling. I knocked once, gently, like a question. There was no answer. I opened the door anyway. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, hunched forward, his elbows resting on his knees. He didn't flinch when he saw me. Didn't smile. Just watched me with an expression that made my throat tighten. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. We didn't speak. I sat in the chair by the window, the same chair I'd sat in weeks before when I was folding towels and pretending not to think of him. The light through the glass was soft, almost golden, in that fleeting hour between afternoon and dusk. I told him I couldn't do this anymore. The words came out low, measured, final. He nodded. He didn't argue. He didn't ask why. I think we both knew the reasons didn't matter anymore. Not in the face of what was already unraveling. He said he understood. And I believed him. But understanding didn't make it easier. I stood, walked to the door, and paused. I told him I wished I'd met him in another life. He said nothing. I didn't turn around. That evening, I cooked dinner like I always did. Roast chicken. Green beans. A side of mashed potatoes. The kind of meal you make when you want comfort without conversation. My husband complimented the seasoning. I thanked him with a quiet nod. Afterward, he poured 2 glasses of wine and gestured toward the back porch. We hadn't sat out there together in years. The night air was cool but not cold. We sat in the old wicker chairs that creaked beneath us, a soft blanket over my knees, the glass warming my hands. Crickets chirped in the distance. A neighbor's porch light flickered on across the street. We didn't speak for a long while. Eventually, he asked me if I remembered the trip we took to the mountains, early in our marriage. I smiled faintly. Of course I remembered. It had rained the entire time, and the cabin's heater had barely worked, but we'd been happy. Young. Still learning each other. He said he thought about that trip sometimes. About how easy everything felt back then. I didn't know how to respond. Then he looked at me, really looked, and asked the question I'd been silently bracing for all this time. Are you still here? Not physically. Not in body. But in heart. In mind. In intention. And I realized, in that moment, that the only honest answer I could give was, I don't know. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He nodded, as if he had expected it, maybe even accepted it long ago. He told me he wasn't angry. That surprised me. He said he'd known for some time that something was missing, and maybe it had been missing for longer than either of us cared to admit. But he had hoped, oh foolishly or not, that we might find our way back. I asked him if that was still possible. He said he didn't know either. We sat in silence again, the kind that comes when everything important has already been said. Later that night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling while he slept beside me. His breathing was slow, even. I wondered if he was really asleep, or just pretending, like I had done so many nights before. My mind wandered to the photograph I'd tucked away weeks ago. The one of the 3 of us on the beach, smiling into a future we couldn't yet see. That version of me felt like another person now. One who still believed love alone was enough. But life had taught me otherwise. Love, without attention, without effort, without honesty, fades. It doesn't explode. It just dissolves. The next morning, I made coffee and stood at the window again. The world looked the same. But I wasn't waiting anymore. And that was the beginning of something. Not a resolution. Not a conclusion. But maybe, just maybe, a quiet return to myself.